So our first speaker is our keynote speaker, who is, I will just introduce him, Dr. Devinder Sharma, who is a food and trade policy analyst on the Great Indian Divide, Opulence and Starvation. He is a distinguished food and trade policy analyst. He was with the Indian Express, amongst the largest selling English newspaper in India. His expertise covers sustainable agriculture, biodiversity and intellectual property rights, environment and development, food security, hunger and poverty, and the implications of the free trade paradigm for developing countries. He has been recently awarded the honorary degree of Professor at Large by the CSK Himachal Pradesh Agricultural University. He has formerly been a visiting fellow to the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, the School of Development Studies at the University of East Anglia, UK, and University of Cambridge. And the most popular Indian magazine, The Week, has listed Sharma in 2009 among the 25 most valuable Indians, calling him Green Chomsky. So, with I think that we are all looking forward to listen to you, Dr. Sharma. The time is yours. Please take it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beena. I think it's a great pleasure for me to join this August gathering. And of course, People's Assembly is very crucial for any country to bring up the people's voices, the neglected people's voices, I would call. And one of the best ways to see or look at the inequality that prevails in the world is to see from the prism of food. And I think food security, as you rightly mentioned in the beginning, and you have given us the ranking that we see globally as far as global hunger index is concerned. And very shamefully, India is at the bottom of the neighboring countries as far as the ranking is concerned. And it happens in a country which is overladen with food and which is also showing signs of opulence. And when I say signs of opulence, it is vulgar opulence that we see on the one extreme, and the kind of starvation we see on the other side. To just give an example, there is a never ending marriage taking place in India. One of the tycoons of India's one of the families has the son getting married, and the for the last 6 months we have been only getting news of the kind of extravaganza that is taking place, and also now it extends to London. And there, the post-marriage activities have begun in that part of the world, and I hope they end by September. But nevertheless, the country has spent, or the tycoon or the business house has spent about 50,000 rupees so far on that ostentatious marriage. And on the other hand, you talked about the kind of starvation that exists in India. Lately, we have a study coming up from the United Nations, the state of food security and nutrition, and it tells us very clearly and very starkly that roughly about 55.6% of India cannot afford a healthy diet. Which means about 790 million people, when they sleep, have not been able to take the balanced diet, and that tells you the inequality that prevails in India. On the one hand, we have the opulence, we have the number of billionaires who are joining the high net worth, club, increasing, multiplying every year, and on the other hand, we have millions of people who are on the marginal, extremes. The point I think which is very crucial is that in a country which has abundant food stocks, in fact, many studies had said that if we were the kind of surplus that India produces, if we were to stack one bag of grain over another bag of grain over another bag of grain, and we were to stack our food in that situation or condition, we could actually walk up to the moon and come back. Now, that's the kind of food we have in the country, and yet we have, as I said earlier, roughly about 790 million people not being able to afford a balanced diet. The number of undernourished people in this country, of course, is also the highest in the world, and we have roughly about 200 million people. I would say a little less than, to be exact, 196 million people who sleep hungry every night. Now, this is happening in a country where, as I said, we produce enough surplus, but also it is very important to understand that the majority of those who sleep hungry are the farmers themselves. the average income of a farmer in India is at the bottom of the pyramid. And in a country where we have roughly about 50% population dependent on agriculture, and which means roughly about 700 million people who are directly indirectly involved with agriculture. And if they have an income level which is pathetically very low, I think it tells us very clearly why we have that incapacity or incapability to assure food for each household in a manner that we would all like to see. Now, this inequality is, of course, the outcome of the bigger inequality that the world must understand. And several years back, there was a very interesting study, which I think each one of us must remember, that one of the institutes, Brookings Institutes, had said that all that the world needs to remove poverty is $100 billion. And $100 billion, of course, the world doesn't have that kind of money. But when we have to produce surplus money, or what we call as quantitative easing in economic terms, then we have all the money. And we have seen in the last 25, 26 years or so, the world has produced about $30 trillion of surplus money. And this is coming from the central banks in the big major economies and so on. And yet we find when we have to really allocate money for removing poverty, everyone has a resource constraint. Now that tells us that you have money for the rich, but we don't have money for the poor. That's one reason why inequality is growing in a manner that the world is now finding it difficult to address. Every time the World Economic Forum meeting takes place, the Oxfam has been telling us and very clearly warning us that the kind of inequality that prevails, only a section of it or a proportion of it is good enough to remove poverty from the face of this planet. But I think if the priorities were to shift to eradicating poverty, much of the world would have been a much better place to live in by now. But nevertheless, the kind of economic design that we have all taken over in the last few decades, the result is that the inequality has been widening or worsening at a level that I think or the major economies are unable to now find a way out to really address that particular issue. Although we have the figures being splashed now and then, but I don't think a serious effort has been made anywhere in the world to see how to bridge that inequality that prevails. I think one of the ways to prevail or to reduce these kinds of inequalities is when the people's voices are taken up in a manner that they become part of the mainstream. I think this is where the Asia's regional assembly, people's assembly that we have for the next couple of days is going to be very crucial in finding or in suggesting what could be the way out to get out of this inequality trap that the world is now faced with. Of course, food is one way to look at it, then poverty, then there are other areas that we are all going to grapple for the next couple of days, at least till the time the assembly takes place. And we will try to see that how the gap has been widening over the decades, despite loud voices coming up that we need to really address these issues first. Having known this kind of a paradigm that exists today, I think the bigger picture before us is how to tame or how to ensure that the economic design is recast, or there's a rethinking on the way the economic design has been laid out, so that we reduce the dependence on, or we reduce or we get away with the obsession that we have on the growth parameters like GDP. I think it is very important for the civil society to understand that GDP, the way it is designed, is basically to measure or to see how more sport can flow for the richy rich. Now that is exactly what has expanded or extended the inequality map that we have before us. I think unless we get away from this obsession that we have with GDP as a metrics of development, we would never be able to aspire or to look at a world where people have the kinds of needs and their utilities or their requirements are taken care of adequately. We have the resources in this world, but we actually are not putting in resources where they are required. I think People's Assembly has been raising these issues, and I'm sure at one stage it will get prominence in the kind of economic model that are being restructured now, because globally there is a rethinking happening, that the neoliberal economic design, or the design which laid emphasis on the income of a few people or a handful of people going up steadily, is now at least designed in a manner that the benefits shifts not only to the so-called beneficiaries but to the entire mass, and the planet also gains out of it. We are also in a very interesting cusp. While we try to colonize the moon, and while we try to find now a foothold onto Mars, and we perhaps believe that this planet is not going to be worth living in a couple of years from now. So we have the kind of economic design that we talk about has led us to that position, that we are now even thinking of setting up a kind of a doomsday vault on the moon, so that when the earth gets devastated, or the planet is in a state where it is not useful anymore to look at the kind of decent living that we are all looking towards. I think they are now trying to venture out onto the outer space to see that we have new places to put our foot down, or to build our palaces, or to build our houses. But the point I'm trying to make is, if this is the kind of shift that is taking place in that economic thinking, that the world is now on one side grappling with it, on the other side we are still trying to ascertain that it strengthens further, so that that kind of a wedge that exists between the super rich and the poor is further widened. So this is a very interesting phase. When I say interesting, in the sense that, are we on the right track, where each one of us gets to have a kind of a living that we all aspire to, or we are getting into the hands where our destiny would be controlled by a handful of people or handful of conglomerates. We know that in the case of agriculture, and when we talk of food security, we are moving from green revolution to what is called as agriculture revolution 4.0. Agriculture revolution 4.0, where most of the countries are very exciting, very showing up exciting possibilities. When we are trying to look at the role digitalization will play, precision farming or precision fermentation would play, when we are looking into what the satellites imagery, and of course drones, and so on, we are slowly and gradually passing on the control over food into a handful of into the hands of a handful of conglomerates, which means the number of billionaires, food billionaires, is going to rise, as some of the studies have already shown. And in the days to come, I think what we eat and how we eat, or where do we grow, all these things will be determined by a new kind of a food clergy that is going to emerge in the years to come. So here we are, while we are all trying to work out that we have food security being taken care of by domestically producing food enough for us. On the other hand, we now have artificial or synthetic food becoming a big industry in the years to come, and it's already heading towards that. The world's first food factory, which does not need land, which does not need farmers, has been set up in Finland. The factory has already started producing food, and that's not the only factory which claims that it doesn't need farmers, it doesn't need land, because all it needs is to draw out some elements or minerals from the air, mix it up with the bacteria, cross with the bacteria, and they're going to produce food for us. Then, of course, we have seen in Europe a huge industry building on insect rearing. Insect is going to be the way forward to extract protein. From food security, we now go on to protein security, which means the insect rearing that is taking place across the world, and we are also we are also seeing a kind of assault on the farmers in Europe. They are being pushed out of cultivation. The feeling is that we don't need farmers now. In America, we of course have a commercial approval for a synthetic chicken. In India, we are heading towards a approval for a synthetic egg, and I think that tells us very clearly that we are moving towards a world where food will be produced, synthetic food will be on our tables. And I'm sure one of the celebrities coming and telling how wonderful this food is, and much of the food habits will then start shifting. But nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make is, if agriculture revolution, if industrial revolution 4.0 is something that we all look up to, or there's a lot of talk about it, we also need to start talking about agriculture revolution 4.0. Is that the kind of a revolution the world needs to move on to? Or yes, of course, there is nothing wrong with technology, but I think we have to use technology in a manner that it doesn't ensure that the farmers get away from farming. And that's a kind of a issue which is not only going to affect a country like India, where we have, as I said earlier, 50% of the population dependent on agriculture, but it's also going to impact countries all across the world. And I think that should tell us, if that is the kind of a kind of a model that we would like to move on. The choice before that ultimately takes place is going to be on us. If we take a call, if we say no, that's not the kind of food we need. We need the kind of food that farmers produce. We need not only we don't need synthetically produced food. What we need is if food prepared in agroecological and sustainable farming systems that the world needs today, which would reduce the impact of climate change also, and try to see that we do not do any more damage to the planet, I think is the way forward. So, so it is time that we try to grapple or come to grips with the kind of realities that are showing a kind of a shifting sand. That is normally the term that is used for. And I think if that is the kind of a shifting sand the world is moving towards, we have to be very, very watchful and careful. I think in the end, all I can say is that do not be shocked, do not be worried about it, that it is going beyond our control. Because I remember one of these African sayings, that if you think that your voice, you're going to be alone and your voice doesn't matter because you are only one person, I think what is important is to understand that if you were to spend a night with just one mosquito in your room when you sleep, that mosquito, when you wake up in the morning, he has already created a hell for you. I think we are all better than at least one mosquito. And I think we can all raise our voices in a manner that the world will begin to listen to us. And I think the hope for a kind of a planet where everyone is assured of a decent living, and we are born with that kind of a hope and aspiration, is something that can be realized, provided each one of us builds up that kind of a narrative that the world requires. So I think with this hope, that the General Assembly will throw up a kind of a voice, a collective voice from the communities, from the policymakers, and so on, and that will tell us what kind of a world we need. I think let's not allow them to get away with it or design a world for us. What we need is to design a world for ourselves, and I think that's a design that we need to build up. I think Global Assembly is an excellent place and a collective and an opportunity which can try to raise that kind of a voice. And I think that narrative change is what the world requires. So, with all this, hoping that the General Assembly will end up giving us a strong message, which will resonate all through the world. And I think that's the world that we can look up to. So, there is a new world that we can create. Yes, it is in our hands. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. Really inspiring words. And I hope you'll be with us for a little bit more time. I'll just open the floor for some questions. But he's challenging us to be more than just a mosquito. And I think that's a challenge that we have to take up. Definitely redesigning. I think that is the key word here, that how do we redesign to ensure that people have food security, access to health, and several other things. And I think one of the key discussions that are now globally happening is the how do we look at a country not just through GDP figures, but have other ways and means of looking at it. That's a discussion for another time, but he did touch upon it. And we have to make it also affordable and accessible as well to various communities. So if you can just stay with us for another 5 to 7 minutes, I'd like to open the floor. If there are any questions, and I'm not able to see the rest of the participants, but if anybody sees that anybody has kept questions, please let me know and then I can call out or just unmute yourself and you can start speaking. Okay, there's a lot of comments about your presentation and how great it was. But anybody has got any questions? He has to go for a very important meeting. So, um, okay. Since
All
there's
right.
no question, I would like to, I'm sorry, is somebody saying something?
No, no, go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead. I was thinking
Adi,
otherwise we
you
can
had
go
a
to the
question?
no. Otherwise, I was thinking we can go to the community voice. But you have a
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, just one question. I know that you mentioned in your presentation that in countries like India, there is more supply, right? There's a lot of, there is a lot of food grains that are going to waste. There's a lot of food that is going to waste. What do you think could be a strategy to ensure? Is it a problem with distribution? Is it a problem with lack of political will? Because if there is enough food and we have enough food, like you said, we can go to the moon and come back. If we have that much of food, why is there such a huge gap that actually people are dying today because of malnutrition? People are dying because there have been hunger deaths reported in the last few years. I mean, we are thinking of technology that can take us to other planets, but we're not able to feed our own population. What would you think quickly, probably in in half a minute or to a minute?
Well, I think it's a very important question. I remember some years back, Amartya Sen had said that famines have disappeared from those countries where autocratic rule used to exist, the dictatorships and so on. But when we look at the countries which are democratic, we find hunger prevailing and persisting. I think it shows very clearly that it's a lack of political will that is keeping a sizable percentage of the population hungry. And as I said earlier, when we have enough stocks, food stocks, I don't see any reason why people should be still living in hunger or not being able to afford a balanced diet, or be in a conditions which are depicting undernourishment. So that's one reason why we have this crisis. I only hope that the kind of impetus that the governments try to push in on the economic growth model or design, if they were to see how hunger can be managed, in a time frame, given time frame, then they allocate that. I think it is completely and easily possible to remove hunger at the international level and at the national level too. As I gave you the figure, internationally there is no dearth of money. They have all the money for quantitative easing, but when it comes to eradicating hunger and poverty, there no country is willing to pump in money or to spare that kind of a money. Nationally, yes, I think we have money for everything else, but for providing hope or in a way of hunger, removing hunger for the poor. So I think that's because it's a question of priorities. And I think the moment or the time when we take on this as a topmost priority, or as an indicator that if you remove hunger, that's the kind of economic growth any country should have, is should become the first yardstick for measuring growth. I think then we will see a kind of a shift taking place.
Yeah, there are just two more questions. If you have time, you can answer, or we could also take it. How do we reconcile being a mosquito and the power of the markets? And what should be the framing of people's voices in terms of creating an alternative framework? Are you able to stay for
Yeah,
a minute and yeah.
I think I recall this when I was some years back speaking in Africa. A lady got up and said that, "Sir, I understand what you say, but the problem is I am just a lone voice. Even if I want to do something, how will it make an impact?" And I thought it was a very loaded question. Before another lady got up and said, "Sir, I want to answer this." And in her answer, she said that there is an African saying that says, if you think that you are alone and you cannot make a difference or your voice will not make a difference, try to sleep with a mosquito at night, one mosquito in your room, and you will see what will happen to you. If one mosquito can do it, I think we are no less than mosquito, at least. I thought that was a very powerful message. And often I use that because many times I find people are dejected and they lose hope that, they are the lone voice, so it's not going to make an impact. But I guess, 1 + 1 becomes 11. So I think it is important to build up those voices. B, what kind of a model that we have. I think the climate change negotiations and the kind of a boiling that the world is now witnessing, climate boiling that the world is witnessing, has clearly made us very, let's say, brought it to into our thinking that the kind of intensive agriculture that the world has relied on hasn't worked. If 34% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture, it tells us that agriculture is a big player when we look at the climate going in aberration. So I think what we need at this juncture is to move on to that kind of a model of agriculture, which is or dependent on food sovereignty, which is also linking up agroecology as the way forward. In Andhra Pradesh, we have a model of agriculture, community managed natural farming, which I'm not sure how many of us know, is perhaps the world's biggest agroecological model that has been laid out, and it's done by the government itself, and already 800,000 farmers have shifted from chemical farming to non-chemical farming. The state of Andhra Pradesh, which is in South India, has plans to convert the entire population in agriculture, which is 60 lakh, which means 6 million. They will be converting into from chemical to non-chemical by the year 2031. I think that's the kind of a model that the world needs to move forward to, agroecologically, using that model, and then of course trying to ensure that for a country where small farmers are now dominating, including in India and everywhere in the developing countries, I think what we need is to go in for food sovereignty as the way forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma. I know that it's a very, very busy time, but you have taken time and been here and answered all the questions. Thank you very much and all the best for your meetings. We
Thank you
will
very
now
much.